I want to thank everyone for joining us today for their second annual lecture on disability and design. I'm Sanjit Sethi. I'm the president of the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. And first, I want to say that I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people in Minnesota. And wherever you are located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. You can find out more information about Indigenous lands at this website, which I'll put in the chat box. We've got to acknowledge that these places have a complex and layered history. As a community such as MCAD that's dedicated to creativity and innovation and empathy, we need to stay committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. We also must acknowledge that bodies were stolen from their ancestral lands in Africa, uprooted from their culture, sold and used as chattel to build the infrastructure of this country. And this country's present condition was based upon these intergenerational and genocidal traumas. As we start with this lecture, I first would like to thank the Target Corporation for sponsoring this series alongside the Race and Design lecture series that MCAD does in the fall. And in particular, I want to point out and recognize Greg Von Bellinger, who both through his stewardship at Target as well as being an MCAD board member has just been a phenomenal partner in some of these efforts. The Minneapolis College of Art and Design is committed to educating that next generation of creative cultural leaders. And our college recently completed a strategic plan that speaks about a concept regarding radical accessibility, where we look beyond the traditional institutional concepts of accommodation and support to a world that celebrates this essential and complex part of our community. The more MCAD unpacks the idea of radical accessibility, it's clear the more we need to understand. So I'm glad you can all join us at this moment as we share this learning opportunity with all of you. From an MCAD perspective, we've got to go beyond the popularity of terms like accessibility or DEI and unpack and embrace the inherent complexity behind them. There has never been a more important time to talk about these issues regarding disability equity and their relationship to design than right now. As part of the MCAD's present lecture series, we also have the fall lecture series, Race and Design, and we know that the two are so closely interlinked. Tonight, we're so fortunate to have our guest panelists, Sky Kuba and Jeffrey Mansfield, with moderation by Joshua Halstead, one of last year's speakers in the Disability and Design lecture. In terms of format, I've asked our guest panelists to speak to what the design world should be considering, doing, asking, challenging, changing as it looks towards engaging more intentionally with disabled communities. This will be followed by a conversation moderated by Joshua Halstead and an opportunity for you all to chime in either by unmiking yourselves or going ahead and adding something to the chat box or signing your questions via video. So first I want to introduce our moderator. Joshua Halstead is an epistemic activist working at the intersection of critical disability studies, design pedagogy, and community organizing. A recognized contributor to disability design discourse, they seek to unsettle and rupture normative systems of thought by centering marginalized perspectives. Joshua has been an invited lecturer in academic and industry settings from Stanford to Google and is co-author of the book Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for the graphic designer. Their current project, CryptJoy, is a transnational majority BIPOC community of practice focusing on reworlding mental health issues through an intersectional anti-ableist and anti-sanist lens. I would say that Joshua has also just become part of the MCAD family through appearing in many dialogues in our community as we've started to unpack these complex territories, and we really see him as a really great friend and thought partner. Next, I'll introduce Sky. Sky Kuba is a non-binary, ex-gender, disabled Filipinx queer from Chicago, Illinois. They are the creators of Rebirth Garments, a line of wearables for trans, queer, and disabled people of all sizes and ages, which started in the summer of 2014. Sky is the editor of the Radical Visibility zine, a full-color cut and paste style zine that celebrates disabled queer life with an emphasis on joy. As a multidisciplinary artist, Sky is interested in fulfilling the needs for disabled queer life with an emphasis on joy. Additionally, they are the access brat and editor of a section on ethics and inclusion called Cancel and Gretel at literary fashion magazine Just Femme and Dandy. Sky has also created a queer fashion program series with the Chicago Public Library called Radical Fit. Sky has over 45 fashion performances and lectured at the Whitney Museum of Art, RISD, the University of Utah, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Northwest University, to name a few. Rebirth Garments has been featured in such publications as Teen Vogue, Nylon, Huffington Post, Vice, Wussy Mag, and the New York Times. Sky was named in 2018 as Chicagoan of the Year by the Chicago Tribune and is a 2019-20 Kennedy Center Citizen Artist and Disabilities Future Fellow. And finally, I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Mansfield. Jeffrey is a principal at Mass Design Group and leads the firm's Deaf Space and Disability Justice Lab, which leverages the design process to uplift the lived experience of deaf and disabled communities. Jeffrey is a recipient of the Ford and Andrew W. Mellon's Disabilities Future Fellowship, a John W. Klug Fellow of the Library of Congress, and co-author of The Architecture of Health, and a co-author of the firm's first monograph, Justice is Beauty. He's taught several design studio courses, including at institutions like the University of Michigan and the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Deaf since birth, Jeffrey's current research explores the formation of deaf and disability spaces as expressions of cultural resistance. So I'm really fortunate to have our three guests with us. And first we'll have Sky present their work.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sky Kubakub, and I use they, them, and they, them, their pronouns. And like Sanjit said, I am the creator of Rebirth Garments. I started Rebirth Garments after gaining a new disability when I was 21. My stomach decided to stop working properly, so I could no longer wear most of the clothing that I liked to wear when I was younger. So I used to wear very tight skinny jeans, and it wasn't working anymore with my stomach. And I also have always had sensory sensitivities, so not having the seams of clothing a lot of times would hurt me quite a bit, and I would have to wear my socks and underwear and sometimes my other clothing inside out. Additionally, I was always interested in gender affirming undergarments since I was an early teenager and did not have access to that type of garment as a person who was under 18. So I started the clothing line because I wanted to see what it would be like to have a clothing line that was intersectional and talking about queerness and transness and being non-binary, but also being disabled, and including every aspect of disability, whether it is apparent or non-apparent, and mad pride. I've always been neurodivergent since I was born, but I didn't have a more physical disability until 2019, or until I was 21. So earlier in the day, I showed a video about the process that I do with all of my models, where I interview them and ask them what clothing would be more gender affirming to them, what would make clothing more accessible to their bodies, what parts of their bodies they would like to highlight, what parts they feel vulnerable about, and what parts they would like to highlight in this context. I would like to show a video of one of my performances. It has audio descriptive lyrics so that blind and low vision folks could also know what was going on with the performance. I usually do these dance parties to show off my clothing instead of the typical catwalk runway thing that a lot of fashion designers usually do, which I feel like are not very joyful and also can be quite deceptive about what the functionality of their clothing actually is. So in my clothing, it's all about radical visibility, which I have my manifesto Radical Visibility, a Queer Crip Dress Reform Movement manifesto. I'll put a link to the abridged version of my manifesto in the chat, which is also in Alice Wong's Disability Visibility Anthology. This is all about taking up space, taking up visual space, auditory space, physical space, textural space as a person with who is multiply marginalized. So when I would do these performances, usually I would have time to give audio descriptions of all of the outfits afterwards if it was in a museum or gallery or university setting, not at clubs, because at clubs they don't even want to hear what your name is. But when I gave a talk at the Whitney Museum, they had me do way too much stuff in a short amount of time. I had to do a performance, a lecture, and a workshop all in an hour and a half. So I was only able to give a couple of audio descriptions of just a few garments. And the curator's partner at the time, who is blind, came up to me and asked me if I would ever consider doing audio description on top of the music, which, as a person with a lot of sensory sensitivities, that always seemed a little bit overwhelming to me. But my friend Jake Voges, who is here on the second issue of the Radical Visibility zine in the blue, was very interested in making music based off of my manifesto. So I went back to them and asked them if we could then use the interviews that I do with my models and also ask them how they wanted to be described and their dance moves and their identities, and then also describe the clothing. So they're the executive producer of 2 albums that we did under the name of Radical Visibility Collective that has this audio descriptive music. And these 2 collections were created in, designed in collaboration with Vogues and Compton Q. And then I did most of the manufacture, I created all of them by hand. And just so all of you know, every single thing that you'll see was all done through taking over 20 measurements of each person, and then me and then a couple of employees or interns at the time would fabricate it ourselves. So I will show you all this video. And this is just one of my favorite songs from it.
Access. Here comes the access. Bitch, we'll call you out, call you up, make sure you're about those success needs. Access, bitch, we'll cause a scene, cause some trouble, she'll be there on the double, you see. Access, bitch, if you don't got ramps, ain't got no lips, when ableists start acting swift, just call on me. Access, bitch, we'll make the change, stage accessible for the full range of gender, size, and ability.
Baby blue when it's monochrome too. You a star right now when they eyes on you. Bleed cut shit, swing with the crotch. Now the whole room probably looking at us. He got cuffs on his arms and cuffs on his legs. Nobody ever said cuffs was only for the big. Got the ass cut out, thighs cut out. Back to hit the city and strut about. He's anxious and nervous, excited and queer. A single white boy with blue eyes and brown hair, and he slays. He got a blue visor for the shade, a blue microphone so the world can hear him sing like. Slow it down for the baddie coming out. Black, young and disabled, but she beautiful, no fable. Rocking pink on pink on pink. Mini dress, but she no strength. Booty shaking at the function. Will she dance and dance with me? Elbow crutches for the Duchess, and she strapped up on her feet. Everybody clap your hands for Miss Alexis, she a queen, yeah. And she got a dolphin tattoo, and that's cool. They, them, always, and the gym. Hustle for the muscle. Kelly, martial arts. Shorty got shield, shorty got steel, shorty got the visor and blue chest binder, silver accents, vinyl armor, hip hop moves, too smooth, too cool, my dude. Next little mama got me throwed, body rolling and she crawling on the floor. Full lips, big hair, so wavy. Latina girl go crazy. She got in long que say, little Spanish for all my ladies. She a bad girl living in a bell world, mesh body suit with the gold trim suit. When she short, but she still stand tall. Me pass high boots and all. She poison like Ivy. Do the cape, walk right by me. She poison like Ivy. Do the cape, walk right by me. Me, I'm thugger fresh in my thugger vest, beating on my chest when I flex, no stress, too easy. These Air Force Ones not Yeezys, two-tone fit, rebirth, too steezy. I'm the type of nigga make a chick milk. Got a big ego, so I keep a big belt, and it's all spandex, so she slid me on, and I always finish first. I'm a champion.
So yeah, I forgot to mention that all of the models were, because we used their own voices and descriptions, they are all like vocal lyrical assistants in these songs. And this was super important to me because of another experience I had in New York, where I met with a audio describer who's like one of the premier audio describers in New York, who was doing audio description for a friend's theater show. And there were a lot of trans and gender nonconforming folks who were in this show. And they took me out to dinner because he wanted to like know how to describe trans and gender nonconforming folks. But he was using all of this really kind of terrible language. Like he'd be like, what if you want to say that it's a man playing a woman or a woman playing a man, but like they're in drag. But I just kept on telling him to just ask the actors how they wanted to be described, especially because he had access to them. It's not like he was making a audio description for a historical film where all of the people have passed away. Like he literally was hired for this theater show and had access to these people. So I kept on telling him to just ask them. And I had also noticed that, and he was an old white man, which definitely old white men dominate the audio description world. And I also noticed it was very common for them to only describe somebody's skin color or race when they're a person of color. So in this, we just, oh wait, it said, oh, sorry. We'll stop because can't see the ASL interpreter. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so just having people have the autonomy to have how the descriptions be how they wanted. And I just think that this is a good example of radical access and a fun, creative way to do audio descriptions that that make the work so much better and also make the accessibility so much more. But I'll let Jeff talk now.
Thank you so much, Sky. It's always great to see your work. I wish we had more opportunity to collaborate more often. I'll go ahead and bring up my couple of slides, and give me just a second here to get set up. Let me just quickly check in to make sure people in the audience, can you all see me? Am I visible? Let me give people time to adjust, pin, or however you need to see. All right. I think I'm all set on my end. Thank you all for being patient with me while we switched over my Zoom setup. Let me just briefly introduce some of the foundational philosophy work we do with Deaf Space and Disability Justice Design Lab at Mass Design Group. If we have time, I might talk through some projects I'm currently working on as well. I really want to think about the next generation of disability justice. What does that look like? You know, actually, for me, I grew up very much a child of the ADA. I started my education as the same year as the deaf community marched to the US Capitol as part of the Deaf President Now movement in Washington, DC. You know, 1 year later, the ADA was passed. And I grew up at a school for the deaf. My parents, both, fortunately, are one of the few hearing parents who both signed. So I was able to be raised in a language-rich environment at home and at school. At the same time, I also was raised up in an environment where you could still acknowledge old remnants and attitudinal thoughts on deaf disability that would oftentimes set deaf people and deaf schools on the margins of society, physically, mentally, and sometimes even on an island, as photoed here in Maine. This is where the Maine's School for the Deaf is located. That boundary, it defines not just how we see deaf and disability, it also defines our communities. This boundary line also defines our expectations, our societal attitudes towards deaf and disability, as shown here on a highway sign showing the School for the Deaf right next to a prison facility. This overlap between these variety of typologies of isolation, exclusion, really start to reflect that schools for the deaf share the same architectural lineage with other state institutions, prisons, and all those institutions have evolved throughout time. They have these stigmas remaining and left into today. And it's very apparent in my upbringing, there's something larger that was at play. So a few years ago, I had an opportunity to travel and visit over 60 different schools for the deaf in North America. And I was really curious on how the architectural forms of vocabulary reflected societal attitudes and changes towards deaf and disability. Those institutions were built in different time periods and eras in a way that architectural pieces reflect societal attitudes at that time period. And there's so many of these buildings are with huge public expenses, beautiful structures, ornate. Aesthetics are exemplary, showing societal values, showing civic pride, and societal virtues, and public confidence. And it's not necessarily designed to meet the unique sensory experiences of deaf people. The style became a way to present the wonderful benevolence of the state, and actually deaf schools were ingrained in a romantic notion about the American empire. Again, as I mentioned, this is not necessarily designed in a way that responds to deaf and hard of hearing people's sensory experiences. We do see some examples, though, of some schools and buildings that were actually designed to accommodate deaf and hard of hearing sensory experiences. And their aesthetics are completely different. They're radically different. And they're more organic in structure. The design is fitting to a deaf and hard of hearing person's way of being, working with natural light, space and order and organization. So deaf people have direct eyesight and sight lines in a circular sitting format. This has shown a huge difference in disparity. And I started to dig deeper. And I saw this parallel between where deaf schools were actually constructed and paths of huge migrations in American history, including the Trail of Tears. There's this parallel with deaf schools being placed. In fact, several deaf schools are directly built as a result and on Indigenous removal acts during the 1830s. And so this presents this idea, this deaf school function as a vehicle of colonization. This American empire building that was happening. And as a fourth generation Japanese American myself, I was thinking a lot about how our society marginalizes people and determines who is accepted in our society. In 42, FDR had Executive Order 9066, demanding the removal and mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, including my grandmother. My grandmother was incarcerated at Tule Lake, the internment camp. After the war, to her passing, she never shared her experience at the camp. It left my generation with an incomprehensible sense of loss. This missing knowledge shared from generation to generation was a struggle to connect with our ancestry, our heritage, and our identity. And that really leads us to my the point I wanted to make here is that our built environment has systematically disabled, displaced, and disenfranchised entire communities. There's a core belief here at Mass Design Group that architecture can do one of two things. It hurts, or it can also heal. We're deeply inspired by the late Dr. Paul Farmer. Dr. Paul Farmer believed that the most marginalized deserved the best. And so to that end, I was thinking about accessibility. Access is not really a project. It's here to dismantle cycles of deprivation and disempowerment. But as we typically think through accessibility, we often think in terms of laws, rights, codes, and the like. Based on our lived experience, we also see how access and accessibility is done through a top-down model. It can be very confining and limiting. It can focus on risk mitigation. That then leads to scarcity or a survival mindset within the deaf and disabled communities and with institutional communities as well. I'm more interested in seeing if we are able to expand upon our understanding of accessibility from a realm of rights to a realm of justice. So in what Sanjit just mentioned earlier, radical accessibility is a framework, and also what Mia Mingus may call the liberatory access. It's an idea of a realm of delight, joy, thought, dignity, spaces that prioritize emotional safety, encourage risk-taking, and is co-created with the community. It's a space of abundance. If we think about, liberatory access, it's an approach that's centered on intersectionality. The intersectionality and agency of disabled, deaf, Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latinx, LGBTQIA+ communities. It's really based from access to make connections, to create communities. We worked with Joshua, who's here with us today, on a deep, thought and really, just a collaboration as we sort of think through frameworks of radical accessibility. How do we deploy radical accessibility? We started with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starting with the foundation of safety, comfort, infrastructure, and making sure you have sufficient technology provided, services, spaces provided, and also, of course, mobility in regards to access and wayfinding. So when these are checked off and good, we can then start to think about how do these spaces become dynamic and responsive and agile to a variety of needs, providing choice and agency. From that point, we can really start to then push further and better understand and get into spaces of liberation, related to that space where we are able to co-create, and we can create and we can decolonize and redistribute power and really inverse this and flip it on its head. This top-down structure of access should be turned around, becoming more of a community-led and a community co-created space. Paul Farmer often would speak about structural violence. Similarly, in his research on peace and violence, Joanne Galtus identified this as physical, structural, and cultural factors that can either promote peace and abundance or can promote violence and harm. Physically speaking, how buildings are created or how complex access is. Structurally speaking, how codes or buildings process or promote or provide barriers to access. And culturally is how we then preserve and encourage cultural narratives and foster cultural plurality and visibility. That idea of that liberatory access, physical, structural, cultural, and those factors working in harmony with each other. I would also want to share and add in that the ADA had a lot of focus on ensuring physical and structural factors. They're responsive to some of those needs, but the cultural factors are something that we're just starting to get into really since this last decade. And it's a moment where we are looking at bringing in and instilling our spaces, our understanding of accessibility with joy and dignity. So we look at how we begin to interpret this into design terms. We think about the idea of universal design language. We want to think about universal design as not just codes or checklists or guidelines. It's more about the entirety of the physical, the structural, and the cultural elements working in harmony and together. Physical elements may be related to how to create space that's comfort and safe and flexible and encouraging, and involving different design principles and toolkits, guidelines, etc. And we also want to promote collective stewardship as well. This is more about creating a structure that would then promote the idea of wide engagement and broad engagement in the design process itself. We want to invoke dignity and inspiration and pride in how these spaces celebrate culture and celebrate identity. So at MASS, our mission is to research, build, and advocate for architecture which promotes justice and human dignity. Let me just very quickly try to surmise one project I've been working on with Gallaudet University. A few years ago, we were invited to participate in an international design competition at Gallaudet. We partnered with a deaf choreographer, as you see here, is Cristano. And we also worked with a multi-sensory artist, Wendy Jacob, who often works with tactile sound. We wanted to think through and how we engage stakeholder groups in very unique sensory experiences. We want to explore what those experiences can bring to the campus. From that collaboration with the local Minneapolis and Minnesota architecture landscape firm 10 by 10, we partnered and developed and worked with artists. We developed this approach that would provide an entrance point to Gallaudet's campus that was based on the idea of a multi-sensory choreography of overlapping visuals, olfactory, tactile experiences. We wanted to create a variety of very unique pathways into campus. So that starts to reflect how we think through the introduction of joy, introducing uniqueness on how we are in dialogue with our built environment, with our spaces, how in a way that creates or amplifies a connection to space. These are ways that we start to think more about how we bring specific experiences, knowledge of deaf and disabled communities in, to then shape our built environment in ways that actually are inviting to all. So I really look forward to this conversation with Joshua and Sky. So let me go and wrap up now, and thank you for listening to my presentation.
Amazing. Jeff, Sky, thank you so much. Every single time that I have the opportunity to be in a room with you digitally or in person, it's special because I learned so much. And it also just feels like it kind of makes my heart jump a little bit, and that's much needed, especially today. Sanjit asked me to just make a few remarks to position myself. In order to do so, I'll just say that I'm come to this conversation as a researcher, deeply invested in disability design by virtue of my being a designer and then also my body. I'm also a design educator, so I teach at design schools. So I'm coming at the topic from that angle. From that stem, I just wanted to kind of frame the first question, because I'm really wanting to get into this dialogue with a quick story of a conversation that I had with my students several weeks ago. We were looking at the philosophy of technology. And in this conversation, there were two dominant ways of thinking about technology, and I think it's similar regarding how we can think about design. On one hand, we can think about it as poiesis, this Greek notion of creating something outside of oneself. So we pull together materials, we pull together people, we pull together all of these things, and then we create something fundamentally new, but it's outside of ourselves. And then on the other hand, there's this idea of physis. So in opposition to this poiesis idea that design comes from outside of oneself, physis says that design is this kind of transformative process from within. The longer I engage in disability design and the politics of design, the more I understand the operation of design as physis, and that's my bias. One of the components of this physis is the concepts that we use and the definitions that we use. Seeming that the audience will be coming to this conversation from different life experiences, professional experiences, etc. And we're talking about a topic that may be familiar or new. I wanted to just start with table stakes. And I was hoping that both you, Sky, and Jeff could give us your working definitions of design and disability. And you can use them, you can pit them against each other, like Jeff kind of did in the last slides. You could use, define them separately. It's up to you, but I just wanted to start us off with some definitions.
Okay, let me jump in. This is Jeffrey. Put me on the spot. I'm on the hot seat, right? Okay. For me, yeah, I would say design is activism. Okay. So as a deaf, disabled person, Joshua, you mentioned it in our conversation prior, but as a deaf and disabled person, we are born activists, right? We have to fight for equal access, for justice. We have to figure out how to navigate a system that isn't designed for us. And we also have to design and adapt and adhere to the world that wasn't designed for us, to better work for us, right? And so we are entering design to change the world, right? And how the world operates. Design and activism are two ingrained roles that are almost one and the same, right? And so to be an activist is to be a designer. To be a designer is similarly, not always, but it's also underlines activism is involved within the creation, creating the world to how you want to enter it and how you want to engage. So that's my definition of design. Now I want to talk about disability. Oftentimes, from my lived experience, disability is, in a way, is a construct. It is how the world is designed. It's how it's constructed, and it's how it's privileged, able-bodied, white, cisgender people, and how the world is designed in a way that is disadvantaged and disables others. So that's a perspective. But I also see disability as a plurality as well. All right, our lived experience, as mentioned, that stigma that's tied into disability is more damaging than helpful. I'd say it leads us to mask our disability. So many of us have an invisible disability, that leads to these masks. Everyone's wearing a mask, it's passing. And it's also, it's permanence. It's a permanent stigma. So in that way, disability is a social construct too. But I'm also hearing people with multiple different disabilities say otherwise, right? So I think it's it has to be an agile definition, has to be a flexible definition to adhere to the multiple different perspectives. So I would just love to hear your perspective, Skye.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Jeffrey on all of that. I think for me, the other idea of design, like the more, industry ideas of design, I get like a bad taste in my mouth a lot of times when I think about design, but mostly in regards to like fashion design. So like for me, I don't usually identify as a fashion designer. I say I'm a garment maker, and I try to position myself with the other garment makers of the world who are largely women, largely POC, folks who are extremely disenfranchised, and a lot of folks who are definitely enslaved and or basically they just can't really advocate for themselves because of the damage that the fast fashion industry has done to the world. So I think of design a lot of times as this elitist, exclusionary thing that is only privileged to folks who have been able to go to design school or things like that. That's not the like fun definition of design though. I love Jeffrey's definition of design. And I think that they can both live together just as like different sides. For me, I didn't identify as disabled until I gained my more physical stomach disability when I was 21. So I've always been very mentally ill and very like radically visibly mentally ill since a young age, as a person with anxiety, depression, and a pretty like visible panic disorder, at least in school. So I didn't get to know about like mad pride until later, or like neurodivergency until later. And I didn't have the language of like the things that helped me the most, where I was like being able to create and always be doing something with my hands. Now we have like the word stimming for like playing with things in order to like focus your mind. So I used chainmail as my main stim and as my way to like cope with life, but I didn't have that language. It wasn't until I had the stomach disorder, and then I started doing the research for my manifesto and started reading a lot of crypt theory, that then I was able to, I loved that crypt theory at the time was such an awesome umbrella term, talking about not only physical disabilities, but also non-apparent disabilities and mental illness or madness. Now I know that there is another faction where CRIP is being more reclaimed by more physically disabled or visibly disabled folks. But that's why then I got really interested in the word disability. I went straight to CRIP when I started my work because I liked the political, like the very political and activism based terms, because I wanted people to know that that's what my clothing line was based from. But then I think I like jumped too far into the future for some folks where they didn't even know that disability was an okay word to say, and they were still saying things like differently abled or like diverse ability or handicapped or handicap capable. So then I was like, okay, I'll reel it back in and just focus on promoting the word disability as an idea. And as Lawrence Carter Long says, like, just say the word. Like, it doesn't matter if it is identity first or person first, just as long as you say the word. And we had a question earlier from the Target folks about like what type of language to use when talking to other disabled folks, or when talking to disabled folks, if you're a person who identifies as an able-bodied or able-minded person. And I always just recommend mirroring whatever language the person is using to describe themselves, and not just trying to like change it and be like, oh no, you're too hot to be disabled, or like, I don't see you in that way. Like, I see you as differently abled or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question, before we dive a little bit more into, what the exciting things that both of you are doing, I wanted to still set the table, so to speak. We have definitions and also concepts, right? So in this space, it's likely that folks will come into contact with terms that define what disability in design is or can do. So some of those terms might be universal design, inclusive design, disability design, liberatory design, right? All of these kind of terms that frame the activity that that we do, making, thinking, etc. I was curious if both of you could share briefly what, if any, of those terms resonate most closely with the work that you do. And if none of them, then what do you use, if anything, to identify or mark out the work that you do? Sky, I think it was really interesting how you identified yourself as a garment maker as opposed to a fashion designer. So would love to just have a little bit more of that positioning conversation.
This is Sky speaking. Yeah, a lot of times in the fashion industry, they talk about adaptive design, and I'm not really interested in any of the terms, really. I mean, universal design is kind of cool, but I more so just always say like Rebirth Garments is a clothing line for queer and trans disabled folks of all sizes and ages, and I just say it like that. I know it's like kind of long-winded, but I want to talk about all of the different identities or types of folks that I'm making clothing for. And I feel like usually saying just one term doesn't really encompass it all. Sometimes I say queer crypt design because I love that, but sometimes that's not a known term. So that's why I usually just describe the whole thing. because like, yeah, sometimes like even in, or as an example with like, with fashion, you know, there's a lot of people talking about like gender neutral fashion or androgynous fashion, but they have all these weird ideas that they're putting onto it, like, oh, gender neutral fashion is only like gray sweatsuits, or like androgynous fashion is only like men's clothes on people who are assigned female at birth, which is like, so for me, I am talking about like queer fashion as like something that is like, you're actually making clothing for every single kind of person, and literally any type of person can wear whatever they want. When I was starting, I had a lot of like trans men who wanted to be able to wear dresses, which I thought was awesome. And that's also something that I was interested in. Like, I'm a non-binary person. I don't identify within anything of the binary, which is why I'm actually identifying as xenogender, which a lot of neurodivergent queers kind of gravitate to, because it's thinking about not between a spectrum of male or female, but it's thinking about a spectrum of like just completely other, like aliens or textures or shapes, which has always been interesting to me, but I didn't have that language until last year even. So like, yeah, I was interested in making like, yeah, dresses for trans men. And I feel like when I started, a lot of people would be like, you can't do that. That's not for a trans man. But it's like literally anybody can wear whatever type of garment they want. And so I just like to give people the freedom to be able to express themselves in that way, and not be like, well, if you're a trans man, you have to wear this, or you have to wear a binder, and you have to wear a packing undergarment, or if you're a trans woman, you have to wear a tucking garment, which was the attitude of a lot of other gender affirming undergarment lines. They were like, you have to do this in order to pass, in order to be the correct type of trans person. And I just didn't like any of that. I wanted to blow it up.
This is Jeff here. Similar. I want to look at how we identify ourselves as, I would say, as an action that represents our complexity, our inherited history, and also our truth, and also our own truth, right? We may not adhere to a certain truth, but we may take on a certain truth through our lived experience. And I think going back to what Sky commented earlier on disability as an identity, you know, crip theory as a framework, as something that I think a lot about just recently on how I, as a deaf person, you know, I'm the only one in my family. You know, I'm a deaf and disabled person in my family, the only one, but how do I have a connection and an experience and a disconnection within my own family, within my own community? And really, that's true for all. That's true for all of communities. We do experience some sense of connection and some disconnection. And, you know, however we present ourselves or however we include ourselves. But I think, for example, you know, I identify as a deaf person, also, you know, with a capital D, deaf. That's culturally deaf, but I also identify as a Japanese American within the deaf community. But how many deaf Japanese Americans are there? You know, now we're in a really small part of the segment of the community, but that is really unique. It's a unique experience that I'm interested in learning what other uniqueness experiences, intersectionality experiences that are represented within our communities, within the disabled community. You know, it's not monolithic. You know, the deaf experience is not monolithic. The disabled community is not monolithic. I think the grand narrative of deafness and disability tends to overlook the richness of the intersectionality of our communities. And so I'm interested in that connection. I'm interested into our inherited trauma or joy or culture aspects of our deaf and disabled experiences, and how we can, you know, receive it from past generations, how it can, generations, that preceded us and preceded me, how we can continue to honor those. But at the same time, I'm interested in how we can bring my own other truth and other identity in a way that is honoring both, or, multiple cultures, within it. So I think that's where it's critical. It's important for us to show up exactly how we want to show up. And I think that's why I'm so ingrained and deeply passionate, and influenced by Sky's work around radical visibility. So often we don't, adhere. So many of us have an invisible disability, and we oftentimes self-select ourselves out of some of our truths. And so radical visibility is a philosophy that encourages us to reclaim our truth. So it's so foundational. It's so critical to how we think about how we show up, and how in our roles as designers or as crafts people. That's it.
Absolutely. Man, well, I had a question about, rights and justice, but I also have a quote from Sky's manifesto that really ties in with where, sorry, Sky, not really. Sorry, not sorry. With the last part of Jeff's answer, and I wanted to read it, and then maybe we can kind of shift into the conversation of, I think as early on in my engagement in the space, Chris Downey, who's a blind architect, said we need to shift from universal design to universal delight. So I'd love to kind of move into this conversation about, not just the standards, but the opportunities of disability aesthetics. So someone who says it much more eloquently than I just did, Sky, from the manifesto, quote, "The current situation for trans undergarments and for people with disabilities is that we shouldn't be stylish because we should, quote, want to blend in, unquote. AKA society doesn't want us, or society wants us to be invisible and not draw attention to ourselves. Feeling confident in one's outward appearance can revolutionize one's emotional and political reality." When I think about the work, your work, Sky, and your work, Jeff, as you're drawing in not just your lived experience with disability and deafness, but also your multiple identities, your intersectional experiences and identities. And you're using that as a tapestry to create, right? And not just create, but to build and compound community. Can you speak a little bit about the opportunities of access from an aesthetics perspective and how that might move beyond compliance and tilt toward joy?
Okay. I'll jump in then. A couple of years ago, there was this book that was published. Deaf Gain is the name of the book. It's a concept and idea that we gain something related to our deafness. It also suggested this whole new aesthetic language that would emerge when we acknowledge and incorporate our actual sensory experiences. How we connect experiences in space is different from how others may experience space. This is something that our society traditionally trains us to ignore, hide. It's almost a capitalist model where we value labor, efficiencies, standards that then promote us and want us to hide our disability. And this then generates a very ableist society. So that, to me, is a loss. I'm very interested in what is gone, what is a loss by shifting focus to ableist, capitalist technocratic models in comparison to what is gained by understanding the holistic experience, the modeling of how we think about space, aesthetics, and then how we create a space for these pluralities to come into play. It's very interesting to discover through my research how deaf schools were designed by the state as one type of aesthetic, but deaf schools designed from the perspective of a deaf person is very, very different aesthetically. And it's interesting to see how both can coexist. However, where people feel most comfortable is typically trending towards the own. And there's different sorts of results. There's different types of genius, different types of creativity that thrives there. A good example of that, of deaf gain, I'll share with you, is deaf people actually using film as a communication medium. This was almost 20 years prior to the first talkie movie. Deaf person invented email, TCP/IP protocols to communicate to his wife when he would get home late from work. These are moments of trying to bridge the different experiences, and they're moments of design thinking. They're moments of creativity that really reflect and present a new aesthetic or a new way of connecting that can impact and expand and enrich our society as a whole.
Thank you, Jeff. I also talk about gaining disabilities rather than, like, I don't know, more negative connotations of like, I was, I can't even think of it right now, but it's like what the journalists always say, like, this person suffers from this, or they're bound to this, and I hate that. I was pulling up a picture that I will share on the screen. This is one of my favorite examples of one of my early, like, really fun things that I did with my design with Rebirth Garments. So I made this in 2016 for my friend CK, whose Roses Are Spread on Instagram. She said that she wanted to have a tight skirt that was really sexy. It still showed off, or the tight pencil skirts were nice because they were sexy and slutty, but they also would keep her legs together. And then she was also really interested in being a mermaid, which I am officially a mermaid from Weeki Wachee Springs Mermaid Camp. So I was so excited to make this mono thigh high that made her legs into a mermaid tail, and then having instead of having the skirt go all the way into the thigh high, having it separate and then connected by garter straps so that there was an escape hole for her calf bag. So I thought that this is one of my favorite examples of something that was like just all these different kinds of things that she wanted for access, but also for cuteness and sexiness, and making something very joyful. Later, I also made her a bunch of these pencil skirts that had like a totally sheer butt, because like we loved the idea that, like, as a wheelchair user, she could go around town wearing something that had her ass like basically totally out, but then, you know, but nobody would know. It would be like a sexy little secret. So then when she would get home, then then it would be all sexy already. So yeah, I think that's some of my favorite designs that I did that I think really encapsulate the joy of creating for disability.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Both answers are so good. I have my wheels are spinning for sure. I have one more. And also I wanted to say that Annie put in the chat, I'll also encourage audience members to ask or to enter your questions in the chat. We'll probably have the opportunity to ask one or two. So if you have questions for Sky and Jeff, please feel free to throw those in the chat or type them. I guess you can't throw them, right? So my question is around, or also you can, thank you, Sky, you can turn on your video if you want to sign your question. So disability design started as a fairly closed space, right? We typically, when we think about disability design, we kind of link it to this idea of, quote, inclusion. But accessibility legislation was fairly exclusive in terms of political organizing, right? And this is part of the tension between disability rights and disability justice. It's also the tension between universal design, right? Going kind of meeting accessibility standards and then going beyond. There seems to be this kind of tension. There always is this tension, always has been this tension in access spaces between, is the space closed or is it open? And when it comes to this question, the question of participation, there are disagreements. Is the space of disability design something for disabled and deaf, mad, sick people alone, right? Is it this, à défendre, right? A zone that should be defended? Or is it porous? Can everyone come in? And that might not be the most subtle binary, but I'm curious in the question of designing with. Sky, Jeff, how should we think about this idea of participation?
I'll go. This is Sky speaking. For me, I do a lot of education for all sorts of people who are interested in garment making or design. Right now, I have been working with the Chicago Public Library for the past couple years on a queer DIY, but also quote unquote adaptive fashion curriculum. And so I'll put that in the chat. It's on YouTube and we have 85 videos so far. And it's talking about all sorts of aspects of just like adornment, body adornment, whether it's accessories or clothing, or I even have a video from a blind sound artist from here in Chicago, Andy Slater, who talks about describing your image. So talking about image descriptions and audio descriptions. So, I mean, I like to promote everybody to be working towards this and even like, yeah, challenging big box stores to be making these different intersections of identities centered and visible and like really committing to them. But I think that there definitely always has to be deaf or disabled or mad or sick folks who are being hired and being a huge part of the process if they are not completely in charge. I mean, ideally they'd be in charge, but I think if you don't have people who you're talking to who, at least in your research, who have these lived experiences, then you're not going to be coming up with something that's very good, in my opinion. And then, yeah, so I'll just say that.
Yeah, Sky, I have very similar thoughts. I think the other thing with design, there's an old thinking of design that one author one author is the genius designer, whoever figures out all those details, that definition needs to be thrown out the door. Let's think about design as a process. It's a process of bringing in a variety of people, bringing people to the table. Design is about plurality. It's getting a lot of different perspectives in design, in the design process. It's what we see more and more. And now acknowledging that my experience as a deaf person might be similar to other deaf people, or we both, grew up at a deaf school, we both use sign language, but we have completely different preferences. So to that, there is a nuance. There is a sense that what works for one person may not work for others. And so we see how disability rights in history typically focus on accommodations, providing them the bare minimum, providing what can be done to accommodate, provide an interpreter, for example. We got a sign language interpreter, but it's not always sufficient to allow for the deaf person to thrive. And so there's still a disconnect between accommodations and what would allow a deaf person to feel, or a deaf disabled person to feel they can get up and say, I can come as I am in my preferences, in my rights, in my truths, in my comfort. And I think to be able to create space that holds a lot of different, contradictions, many different perspectives, is where we see, what we see now is kind of this exploding to deeper thought and thinking about disability justice and how we create and make sure, how we make sure other forms of oppression, mass incarceration, racism, ableism, all are interconnected and interweaving pieces. They all show up in different ways. And so right now we are seeing more acknowledgement of a greater ecosystem of an intersectional experience. And so, yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Right. So pluralism and tension and contradiction and complexity and contingencies, right? All of that. That is design, that is making, that is living, right? Most of us would say. So we have two questions from audience members. I wanted to start with Jessica's and then go to Sonia's, because I think Sonia, with the question of resources, that would be a nice kind of endpoint for this. So Jessica M. Dandona asks a big question, perhaps, the question that we've kind of been tinkering around the sides. So Jessica says, it seems to me that, quote, design, unquote, conventionally defined, is inextricably linked to the market. And the market typically seeks to provide services or products to a broad majority. How can design that is inclusive and justice-oriented be cultivated without inadvertently falling back into these models of consumerism that serve the majority and are tied to profits, efficiency, and other capitalistic goals? How do you introduce joy when still tied to market economics?
This is Sky speaking. I'd like to talk about this. I would say the idea of the broad majority in itself is entirely a false idea, because most of us who have marginalized identities are the majority. Like POC folks are such the majority in the world. So it's more so just this idea of like who in society is valued, and we see that society's only valuing like white, cisgender, tall, skinny folks, like, and especially men. So like I'm talking about fashion, but also everything. So like I remember when I was trying to go to fashion school, and I was making my designs and drawing them on real sketches of traces of my friends and people, and they really wanted us to be drawing this idea of the 10 head high figure, and they kept on telling me that I needed to think about making things that were more marketable or more better for the mat, like the just like, yeah, better for more people. And I would argue that I was making better and more clothing for the majority of people, and like, but they had this false narrative that the marketability or they kept on saying mainstream. They kept on being like, make your stuff more mainstream. But I would like to say like that their idea of mainstream was also false, in the same idea that the broad majority is false. But for me, like I have always had it so that anybody who, because I pay my employees always at least $15 an hour. Actually, I think $16 an hour at least now. But like, I still always have sliding scale and free options for anybody who needs it. And I always just work it out where I'll get donations or I'll get a big grant or award in that year, and I'll use that to subsidize the clothing line. Or I have another business called Radically Chill that's like CBD products, and I use the profits from that to subsidize the clothing line in order to keep it at a more manageable price point. So I think that there's always ways to be redistributing wealth there. I mean, as we see, there are many billionaires who could be using their money for much greater purposes, but who are hoarding the wealth. But there are still other wealthy folks who can buy things at higher price points that can then subsidize other things. So I think that there should be a lot more stores that or like, yeah, designers who work in this way where they can kind of redistribute that wealth and make it more, I guess, equitable for folks. And yeah, so that's what I do.
Yeah, no, similar. I agree. The false narrative around the market. Yeah. Thinking about I think about the opportunity of cost, right? Of not creating more, I would say accessibility in society. We are missing out on some of our best resources. It's people, it's lived experience, it's people. And the people are our best resources. So if we are to be masking, then I'll have to ask, what are we missing? What is the opportunity? What's the cost of doing that? And it's interesting too, if we want to continue that capitalist framework of economy return, I'm interested by Rich Dovin, his research around the return on disability. Rich Dovin did a study of the Fortune 500 companies and really studied their DEIJ principles and disabled principles, and studied it and recognized that organizations who have a better approach to disability and equity and inclusion, they typically perform better in the market than those that don't have as well principles lined up in that area. So the evidence and the argument is prioritizing the mainstream, like you mentioned, but that's a myth. It's a myth of the white cisgendered capitalism. And so what I think Sky is speaking to is the idea of, collectivism. It's it's not just mutual aid, but it would be about bringing the community to support each other, to orient or move towards a different framework, not about the financial return on investment, but looking at it more from a social return on investment. We benefit better as a society. It's more, we're more equal. We have a higher quality of life. The abundance is there. And I think framing our argument from the traditional capitalist mainstream framework, we need to move away from.
Wonderful. No small task, but most would argue of urgent importance. So last question, and then after this question, I'll have turn it back to Sanjit, and Sanjit can close us out. The question here from, let me not lose it. 1 second. Sonia is, do you have any other books you would recommend? And I think this question could last for a while. We don't have too much time, so I might just ask, what is one book that you might recommend, or a handful if you're Sky?
This is Sky speaking. I put in the chat the link to my manifesto, and this has a 6-page bibliography of a gazillion books that you could read. And then, yeah, Disability Visibility, like I said, edited by Alice Wong, and then this new book, Unmasking Autism by Dr. Devin Price, which I'm also featured in. They're great books. And yeah, always only read books with people from people who have the lived experiences. Don't read the books that are by parents of disabled kids or caregivers or doctors who don't have it. Those are bad news.
Jeff here. I'll pitch a few. One, I just recently read, one being, it would be, I'm sorry, I missed it. It's Jai Preeti Verdi. It's her book. It's Hearing Happiness. I will put the name into the chat so we get it right. And the other one is Katie Booth. Book is Invention of Miracles. Invention of Miracles, spotlighting at the impact of A.G. Bell had on the deaf community, and also how we understand disability in our society. I also want to, I often read so much of theory and philosophy books, and I think one book that really has had an impact on me greatly is the Book of Expression by Raymond Antrobus. Raymond Antrobus. And it's called The Preservation, or the Preservation. It's deeply emotive. It's resonant. It resonates. It's the approach to delivering his own deafness and his intersectionality and his experience, his intergenerational trauma, his joy. It's all merged. It's so powerful an expression. It's an expression, and it continues to be a reminder to me. And I think about that book a lot, just very much recently. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. Sky, I'll also say the next thing you should read is the thing you were going to read, but with the lens of this conversation. I think that's how things start to shift. Okay, Sanjit.
Well, I just really want to thank Joshua, you for the moderation that you did and your additional insights once again to be part of this community. And Jeffrey and Sky, thank you so much, both of you, for all of your insights today. And really look forward to having you back and for future conversations at the college. Just for the audience, thank you for participating in our second annual Disability and Design lecture series here at MCAD. And we'll make sure that these recordings will be available online. So definitely check back on the mcad.edu website and they'll be available soon. So thanks everyone, and so appreciative of the conversation.